So another question that I get is what I use to create a painting as far as subject matter. Sometimes people ask me, am I painting solely from life? Am I using photography, or is it something that I'm just pulling out of my head? And the easiest answer is that everything that I paint, everything that you see, initially starts from something that I have set up right in front of me as you see it. There are things that I certainly push and pull and move around, but I set up all of my still lifes directly in front of me. Having said that, during the course of that painting, the life of me painting it, it moves from painting from life into photography, and then usually at the end into kind of imagination. This painting is right at the end stage, so I thought it would be a really good one to kind of show you that kind of life cycle that one of these paintings takes. This painting was set up completely in front of me. Everything that you saw was just as you see it now. I've recently moved my studio, so I had to take everything, all of the still life setups that I had to come down and get packed up and move to my new studio with me. It would be really difficult, if not impossible, to set some of the things up the way that you saw them, or the way that you can see them now. And on top of that, the lighting setup is completely different, and not to get into too much of that because you could spend hours and hours talking about how light hits and affects different objects. The windows that I'm using now are simply, they're north-facing windows, but they're just not the same as the ones in the old studio, so there'd be no point in me trying to replicate this from life. But in the end, if I was going to be finished this painting in my old studio, I'd be doing it the same way as I'm going to do it now. And this is the final stage of it. This painting is at the 90 to 95% finish mark. So that basically means that I'm going to be painting from my mind and my imagination, and basically looking at what I have down and pushing it, pulling it the way that I want it, not the way that I see it, or not the way that I see it in life, or not the way that I see it in a photograph, but the way that I want to see it in my mind. And it's really difficult to describe when you're looking at a color in life, and you're looking at a color in a photograph, and then you're looking at a color in your head of how you want it to be. There are definitely three distinct areas there. This one right now is at the point where everything is finished. Everything is, the drawing is there, the value statement is there, the color statement is there. It's just the level of finish. I could technically call this painting done, and I guess somebody would be fine with that. I'm not fine with it. It would drive me up the wall to know some of these little things that are going on here that I can see, and a lot of times only I can see. But it's just something that when I look at it, there are definitely passages and areas specifically to color that I know can be pushed a little bit more to kind of make this tell a story a little bit better. If I want to say tell a story, I mean get to the point where your eye is starting to see these things moving around in volume. Your eye starts to think, man, is this actually 3D or 2D? So that's really what we're dealing with. As far as, I'm not going to show you the whole, because I'm probably going to do another 2 or 3 hours on this, but I'll probably show you 5 to 10 minutes or a quick sped up version of what I'm going to do to this background, because when I've reached this stage, more times than not always, but more times than not, I'm going to work back to front. I'm going to finish the background, because everything that you see here is judged off of what this is. So if this is, I'm not going to darken it down. It's the value and the color is right where it needs to be. But if I was to darken this down or lighten it up, all of this changes then. I mean, because some of the centers of interest and the highlights have to change with that. But basically what I'm going to do is the same tone and the same tones that are in here, I'm just going to put a few more lighter, I shouldn't say lighter, a few more thinner coats of paint on it to bind everything together, to make it look a little bit more uniform. Because right now, you can't probably see it from back there, but there's still, I can still see brush strokes, and some of the underpainting is still showing through. And that, when you see that, your eye kind of will move over the surface of the paint, and any of that type of gradation or texture, your eye's going to stop and it's going to bounce around that. And in the end, especially with the background, I don't want that. I don't want your eye jumping around back here, moving around. I want your eye up in here. So the background's job is to kind of push everything forward. So in order to do that, I'm going to try to get all of this slight gradation smoothed out. So think of it almost as a sanding process. If you're familiar with any kind of woodworking, if you've ever worked with wood, it's that final stage where you run your fingers over it and you can still feel a little bit of texture in the wood. We're just wanting to kind of take that down and get it to a nice, even surface. That doesn't mean that there isn't going to be variation in color, just everything is going to be as uniform as far as surface and value. There's going to be a little bit different color in here, and I'll talk about that in just a second. So that's pretty much what we're going to do. I'm going to move from here and then work my way up into some of the objects, and lastly probably hit this area with this shadow here. I don't want to get too much into a lot of the painting techniques, but another, I don't want to say trick, because so many painters know about it and so many painters throughout history have used it, but one of these things is this line that when you're painting on a tabletop or a surface that's moving back into space, this edge that hits the wall, it needs to be softened, smoothed down. That edge needs to be dropped a little bit further down than it would in nature, because in nature, when you see things, when you're looking at that tabletop and you were to look directly at this line, it would appear somewhat crisp. This is just one of these devices that painters will use to trick the viewer into thinking that you're seeing something that's moving back into space, which technically you're not. There's nothing on this surface that is, ahead of something else. It's pretty much, the surface is all smooth, it's all plain. I don't build up the surface technically, but taking this edge and knocking it down, using my imagination to kind of push it down a little bit further than it would be in nature, is just one of those things that painters will do to kind of give you the illusion of 3 dimensions. So yeah, I think that's pretty much what I'm going to deal with in this video as far as the painting part of it. The other part that I've talked to a couple people, especially at my old studio. I had this wall that was, it was a grayish color. I don't know what the color would have been called, but it was a gray. But when natural light hit it, when I had my windows open and the sunlight, not sunlight, but the natural light came in and kind of cascaded through, the wall stopped being gray, and it had a really luminous pink and green quality to it that, yeah, I guess I could take a tube of gray paint and just put white with it or black with it and move it across the surface, and that would be okay. But one, I don't own any black paint. I probably have I might have a tube of it in the drawers, but I don't use black paint I don't use the color black on my palette. And I'll probably make another video that talks about what colors I use and why I use them. But when I'm making grays, and even in my paintings that have notes that appear black or super, super dark, they're not made with black or any color that appears to be black. They're usually made, almost always, with a combination of these 2 colors. This is Windsor green yellow shade, and this is alizarin crimson. Sometimes there's a couple other colors that I'll add to these to modify that, but I've used these two, this is probably my third tube of this, and this is my second or third tube of this guy, which that doesn't mean anything to anybody else other than I have tubes of paint that I've had for 7 or 8 years that I still use. I cut through these guys very, very quickly for me. So what this color right here that's on the back here is basically these two in white. So what I do is I'll make a couple pools of color on my palette. One that is shaded towards the green, one that's shaded towards the red. But if you were to take a photo of those two colors and then convert that image into black and white, the value where those colors fall on a grayscale will be very close to one another. But because they're one slightly green and one slightly red, when you put them over top of each other, they start to kind of vibrate, and they add richness and color to something that didn't really have anything to begin with. So that gray no longer is a black and white, lifeless neutral. It's something that has color, it's something that has life, it's something that a lot of these colors are used throughout this piece, so it ties together, and that's again another device that painters will use, but I'm not going to get too much into that. So those are the colors I'm going to use, 3 tubes of paint to work on this, and then the brushes that I use, which I get asked about what kind of brushes I use, and in the end they're varied. I use I use pretty much whatever works. That's again another lesson that I learned from my illustration professors. Don't tie yourself to one technique or one brand of paints, or try different things, find new things, learn, and that's the way you're going to grow. So I use a little bit of everything. The first 2 brushes are going to be pretty, I think, common. It's a flat. This is going to allow me it's a synthetic flat. It's going to allow me to, color the surface pretty quickly, and also, up and down, left and right. It's going to allow me to start blending those 2 colors together. So I'll probably use 2 of these, one for the green, one for the red, and then just move it back and forth. And then I'll use something like this. It's a round that is, I don't know what size it is. It's a 2 or 3. It's a 3. It's a 3. And this is basically to cut out some of the more detailed edges, and also when I'm going around this little area down here. And the final brush or brushes that I'm going to use, they definitely fall into the use what works category, because they're not, I don't know if these are artistic or artist approved, but they're these guys, and these are makeup brushes that I've gotten at Target, and you can certainly buy blending brushes and fan brushes, and I've seen really super nice blending brushes for artists that are like $20 and $15 for just a small one. This was $1, and this was like, I don't know, $3 or something like that, and I've had them for a long time. They last if you take care of them. But yeah, so this one is for blending eye brush, so whatever that is, and this one is a bronzing brush, which I get an idea of what this is for. The bronzing brush, I don't know. I have no freaking clue what that is, but I can tell you what it does for paintings is that when you get your surface nice and flooded with paint, and you want to kind of knock down some of the brush strokes, if in fact you want to do that, you're basically taking this, and I'll try to get a close-up of this because this is kind of important. You're just using the brush to kind of touch the surface. If you think about the surface of paint and there's paint built up like this, we're just kind of just lightly pushing it down so that it blends down a little bit. What we don't want to do is drag through it. If you start to drag through the paint, you're gonna, in the end, you're gonna make more brush strokes, and that's not what we want. At least that's not what I want. I want to try to keep this surface back here as uniform, like I said, as possible, and this brush allows me to do that. So, makeup brushes. And the other thing I guess I get asked about at this stage is if I use mediums or what do I add to the paint. At this stage, I try to add as little to the paint as possible. I'm trying to use paint that's pretty straight out of the tube. Sometimes that's just, you can't do that because the paint's a little too stiff, depending on what's in the pigment. But to loosen the paint up to a nice, like, think of, like a cream consistency, or like almost like a whipped cream consistency. You're wanting to get it so that it's, it has a little body left to it. Again, this is more something that you have to be there, you have to feel it, but it's not wet. It's not like a watercolor or an acrylic paint that's been watered down. It's something that, as you squeeze color out of a fresh tube and you see it like that, this is what we're wanting to go for. Mainly because if you put paint okay, so we're ready to go on this painting, working on the background. I've got the two colors that I'm going to be using initially pre-mixed on my palette. There's one that's leaning towards the green, one that's leaning towards the red. And basically what I'm going to do is just start scrubbing them into the surface, putting them down so that I can get a workable layer on here that I can start pushing and modifying. So initially it's just about getting the surface covered or flooded with paint, however you want to describe it. So okay, so now we've got the surface pretty well covered with paint. I pretty much just used the red notes that I pre-mixed up on my palette. I mixed a little white with it to put in here because as the window that was directly next to this still life, it is basically shining the light source from left to right. As it was hitting the back wall, I mean, this part of the wall is going to be lighter than this one. So I'm kind of painting in a rough gradation of light. I'll kind of refine that as we go along, but now this whole surface is covered in paint for the most part, and I'm going to switch over to the green notes and start pushing those in and then moving them around, and then we'll just go back and forth until we get something that's relatively solid and stable looking. So again, here's another example of when I'm working back to front, being able to correct something that's just happened. As I'm brushing down in here, I drag some color right into this little chest piece up here. Just load up a brush with, or not load it up, but dip your brush a little bit into your solvent, and this part right here, just you can pull it right away. And just cleaned it up. And we're good to go. So another thing I want to mention is when you're painting like this, especially dry brushing and basically using direct paint like this, is to vary your strokes, not to make everything, when you're laying paint down, everything this way or back and forth. That's kind of why you see me move the brush back and forth, is because that helps vary the way that the light appears to be moving across the surface or across this back wall. Light doesn't, the wall isn't one flat surface of glass, even though it's a flat wall. Light hits it, and it's not this pristine gradation. A lot of times it has bumps and nicks out of it and things of that nature. So that's why you're going to see me moving the brush around like this to kind of just vary it up enough so that your eye isn't seeing things that are this stylized sheen from left to right or up and down. So that's when I move the brush around like that, that's why I'm doing that. Alright guys, I think that's pretty much going to do it for the background section here. As a quick recap, we used really two colors, these two colors, and modifying them with white to form kind of a gray that moves from warm to cool, and basically using two types of brushes to apply the paint. A flat and a round, and then two types of blending brushes to kind of knock the brush strokes down. Again, modifying brush strokes, the direction that you're moving, and then I guess moving, I didn't really talk about this, moving from the initial strokes, approaching them kind of like dry media or like pastel or pencil, just kind of scrubbing in the whole section to kind of get a base to work on, and then moving from that into a dry brushing or scumbling technique where I'm pushing color onto color and moving it around until it gets to a point that I think that it's kind of vibrating and looking alive. And I think that this background now has enough of that going on. There's reds and there's violets, there's greens and blues, and the light to dark and warm to cool relationship is there, and I really think that it's doing what it should be doing. So the next stage is to kind of move forward, and we'll start addressing object by object finishing, and that's really how I finish a painting. Once it gets to the point where I'm comfortable with value relationships, color relationships, warm to cool relationships, and the drawing is set, finishing is just a matter of pushing and pulling color and temperature to get to a point that I feel when I step back that the piece is alive, that it looks like it's being truthful to nature or to my imagination, to my memory, to what I remember it to be. So yeah, that's what kind of, I would say, how I finish a painting. So again, hopefully that helped, and if you have any questions, please, as always, put them in the comments, send me an email, send me a text, and I'll answer what I can. And what I can't, I'll try to point you to a direction or a person that I think could answer that for you. So happy painting, all the best.